Everyone, it is the 9th of July, and we're delighted to have you with us. We have Vint Cerf. We're expecting David Bray to join us, and we have Anthony Scriffignano. How do I pronounce your name, Anthony? Say it.
Scriffignano. It took me till third grade.
Scriffignano.
Scriffignano.
You know, I spent a lot of time on classical radio and had to pronounce people from all over the world, all right? But I actually have never heard you say it. So now, say it again.
The end is like lasagna, Scriffignano.
Scriffignano. Okay, I like it, all right? And we're really happy to have you with us. We're going to talk about where the internet is going with the father of the internet, Vint Cerf. Anthony. Marcy Harris sends her regrets. She's not able to be with us today. And I'll be introducing David as soon as he joins us. With that, Vint, would you like to kick us off on the topic at hand? And then we'll go into more discussion. Anthony, we look forward to your remarks after Vint, and we're looking forward to having David with us. With that said, Vint, it's all yours.
Oh, thank you very much. It's nice to see Esther. Hi, Esther. It's good to see you and everyone else this morning. First of all, perhaps we can start with, so where are we with the internet? And I would say that, well, it's a mixed bag. It's estimated that maybe 2/3 of the world's population has direct access to the net, but of course, even those who don't have direct access are affected by people who use applications on the internet, and many of them using mobile apps. And I might tangentially say that mobiles have become so central to many of the daily lives that when they don't work, there are cascade failures, and I'm quite concerned about that. It would become extremely dependent on mobiles functioning successfully. So we might want to give some thought to resilience in the internet environment where multiple devices can serve rather than being so dependent on the mobile. The second thing I would observe is that the early days of internet were extremely open. We published the designs, we published papers, we made software available for either implementation or at least testing. And openness was a very important part of its character. And I think that still is true today, but we are being affected by the fact that the general public now has access to the internet since 1989, roughly speaking. And the consequence of that is that some people use the technology for their own purposes that may not be necessarily in everyone's interest and may in fact be fundamentally harmful. And you can make this long list of things, whether it's malware, denial of service attacks, phishing attacks, ransomware, and I'm sure, fraud and all kinds of other conventional sorts of bad behavior, not to say even criminal behavior. And all of those things trouble us as citizens, and they trouble countries and the administrations as well. Some countries are so concerned that they want to take measures to protect the safety, security, and privacy of their populations. And so we're seeing a great deal of agitation in the legislative and regulatory sphere to try to somehow contain the harmful behaviors that we see in the internet environment while trying to preserve a lot of the benefits of all of the openness that the system has fostered. Freedom of access to information, freedom to share the information and to discover it, to say nothing of building applications on top of it, some of which have had very significant economic impact. Now, there are some countries who look at the internet as a threat, not so much to their citizens' safety and security and privacy, but to the privacy or security of the regime itself. And so you'll see that show up in authoritarian regimes. David, we started before you arrived, and if you permit, I'll just keep going.
Keep going. I had to take care of Dylan, so go ahead.
It's not a problem. We anticipated that might be the case. So we have regimes that are out there trying to use the internet to repress knowledge from their populations, or to surveil them, or to do other things to control what they consider the safety and security of the regime, and that's a troubling outcome as well. I want to overemphasize, I think, the thread, not threat, but thread of openness and its benefits. One of the big issues arising these days is the free flow of information across the internet, crossing international boundaries. There are some countries that would like to constrain and contain that. We hear the term data sovereignty, which sort of looks back on the Westphalian model of the world, where geographical boundaries allowed countries to exert absolute authority within their geographical boundaries, and they would like to see the same thing happen to the internet, but that fragments the internet, and that eliminates or at least reduces its utility. So I feel at least some of us, maybe all of us on this call, have been fighting that battle to keep the internet as open as possible, and to explain that hiding information within a geographical boundary does not protect it. It might give the government the ability to access it, where they might want to make demands on companies for surveillance purposes or other things, but it certainly doesn't protect it, because the internet continues to be a very global phenomenon that's insensitive to the passage of data across international boundaries. So in fact, the freedom to move information around is vital to commerce, and it's certainly vital to academic work or research or business. It's important that we be able to move information around. If you really need to protect it, you should encrypt it, and then it doesn't matter where it is. You just have to make sure you control who has access to the keys to decrypt that data. So I hope that we can introduce a meme that says data protection is not the same as confining to a geographical boundary. So I think at this stage of the game, we are in a, I won't say we're locked in combat exactly, but we are in fact under a lot of pressure from governments that want to control access to and use of information. And they go so far that they often end up with what I'll call extraterritorial outreach. The most recent manifestation of that I encountered is in France, where the parliament wants to control access to the internet by controlling the domain name system, and some of the things they want to do have a very extraterritorial element to them, and that's not a good thing either. So I hope that in the course of this conversation, we will not only be able to outline what the challenges are, but maybe some of the things that we can do in order to preserve the value that the internet has demonstrated. Just one last point, the Internet Governance Forum is one place where that debate takes place. It will happen again in Kyoto this year. And there is a leadership panel which is recently constituted that I chair now, and they are trying to amplify the messages coming out of the IGF in places where those messages might not normally arrive, in order to gather more energy behind keeping the internet as open as possible. So I'll stop there, turn this over to David, who is our official moderator.
David, we're glad to have you with us, and you had a really good reason for being delayed. So
yes, well, I appreciate it. I was going to say that's as folks who know from the PCI days, what was a newly adopted baby boy 6 years ago is now a healthy 6-year-old that's actually past 4 feet tall. I don't know how he caught up, but I give all credit to my wife. He wanted his slip and slide set up, and so it was taking a little bit longer than expected, but you know, slip and slide, as much as I want to be with you all, I had to make sure he was taken care of. So I'm glad to be here with Vint. It's sort of a family reunion of sorts, with everybody here with people-centered internet. And it really is meant to be a sort of free-flowing dialogue. We'll make sure, I don't see Marcy yet, but hopefully she will also be able to join too.
Marcy sends her regrets.
Oh, okay,
yeah, she's in a place. She's in a place, David, where internet access is either not there at all or uncertain. So she sent regrets.
I understand. I sometimes work in those places, but yes, I can understand. So we will make this open, and it's meant to be free flowing. We also have a good friend, Dr. Anthony Scriffignano, to provide sort of the perspective of data and AI. And so maybe I'll go to Anthony sort of to give a little bit about his perspective. And then if it's okay, it was sort of meant to be sort of a free flowing dialogue. I'll give sort of my thoughts that build on this, and then we'll circulate to everybody else if that works.
Thank you very much, David. Probably the only way to appear lame in opening remarks would be to follow Vint, but I will do my best.
That's why I
Um,
volunteered you to go next.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
You're gonna
Thanks a lot. I'm Sicilian. We have a way of getting revenge.
Exactly.
So just a few thoughts, and in combination with the internet, we have to think about data and AI, and it's such a broad topic that we could spend a ridiculous put everyone to sleep. But I have a few of the bigger rocks that I think we should think about in the context of this discussion. The first one, the sort of elephant in the room, is large language models. I'm not naming any of them in particular, but I think we all know who they are. These are becoming, it's not a new idea, but it's suddenly a new shiny object, and they're becoming much more democratized, much more readily accessible to all. And that can be a good thing for certain things. If I wanted to summarize what's on the internet in a domain that I don't have time to research completely, I might start there. But we have to be very careful with large language models because they are sort of the madness of the masses, right? So they will learn what the common repetitions are much more quickly than they will learn about the corners. And many people in this group are very interested in those corners. So we should be careful when we read things that are second order information, because they are in a way digital hearsay. And that is a very dangerous thing. It's a good thing in some ways, but it's a dangerous thing. So be careful what you ask for. The second thing, which is sort of a close cousin to that, is that a lot of times you'll hear the terms AI and ML mixed together. And I think people just mumble it and look at their shoes and hope nobody asks what the difference is. I spend a lot of time thinking about that. So all ML is AI, but not all AI is ML. And machine learning algorithms spend, I love all the nods going on right now. Machine learning algorithms spend a lot of time, it's just math, right? It's regression. They spend a lot of time looking, these are supervised methods, looking at the past and sort of doing the same kind of thing mathematically, summarizing it in a way, and trying to project into the future, which is presumed to be reasonably like that past that it was trained on, in order to make predictions about things. And again, for certain types of things, this is fine. I don't think any of us would want to drive our car based on a summary opinion of what the yellow line down the road was doing behind us. And yet we do the equivalent of that in AI every single day. It's happening right now. So we have to get the AI practitioners who are coming out of school, who have mostly learned those methods, because you have to get it done in a semester, and the data that they're given contains the answer, and all of these sorts of things. So everything looks like a nail when you've learned very well how to use the hammer. So we have to be really, really careful about that. Synthetic data exacerbates that situation. So we're getting better and better and better at creating data to fill in the holes for the data that we don't have. Well, guess what? If you're looking for anomalies and you fill in those holes with data that look like everything else, it makes the anomalies harder to see. So again, be careful what you're doing and what the knock-on effect of what you're doing has on the research question, or the operating conditions, or the first principles of what you're about for your particular situation. Vint, I love the fact that you put a lot of focus in your comments on regulation. Regulation is changing everywhere as we speak. And I am a scuba diver, and I like to point out that regulator is pretty darn important, right? If you didn't have a regulator, your lungs would blow up. But if you regulate everything, then there's no air and you can't breathe. So the regulators are tasked with regulating this unbelievably rapidly changing environment, and their job is to produce regulation. And guess what? The innovation will always outpace the regulation. So we got this yin yang going on right now all over the world, where they're trying to out-regulate each other with respect to AI. I love the comment about the IGF, sort of a mature adult way of looking at this in a more holistic way. We need more of that. We need more of this thinking about the way it impacts the world, not the way it impacts a market or an economy or a particular industry or the thought. Just a simple example of that would be agency, right? In the law, when we all, when you take your first course in business law, you learn about this concept of agency. If you hire somebody to deliver dynamite for you, and they do exactly what you asked them to do, and they trip and blow something up, you are in part responsible for their actions because they're acting as your agent. Not so much with your digital agent, right? The laws haven't caught up with that yet. So if you're AI, we've seen these epic fails with AI chatbots getting racist or things like that. That's only the beginning, right? What happens when this starts to infect decisions that are being made on the IoT, or when this starts to infect the decisions about which data the police look at or which data the doctors look at, and on and on and on. So we have to be very careful about this concept of, what is the law allowing? What is the law paying attention to? How are the regulators protecting us? You mentioned sovereignty, the cross-border data flow regulation. There's data sovereignty regulation. There is these extraterritorial components of these laws are incredibly pernicious. You can be your citizens of a given country are like little bubbles of compliance to that anywhere they go, if you read these laws very carefully. And so you have this problem of trying to comply with the natural join of all of these laws, which becomes impossible because many of them are antithetical to each other. So that's a very big deal. The fourth thing that I wanted to point out quickly was a lot of these laws are requiring things that are inherently possible. So we use terms like transparency and explainability, and we throw these terms around like everybody knows what they mean. And yet, in this group of experts, if we asked everyone to define those two terms, I guarantee you we would get nuanced and varied definitions for those things. So I would say transparency, absolutely. Explainability, maybe not so much, because maybe we can't handle the truth. Maybe we can't understand the explanation of a hybrid AI method that might have used 1,000 repeating algorithms in a very short order against data which has already changed to produce an answer which may or may not be relevant by the time we get done understanding it. We have to think about being able to say, how do you know you didn't use this? How do you know you didn't do that? There's sort of the contrapositive, which we all learn to hate in logic, but it's becoming very important in AI. And then the last thing, actually the penultimate thing, we shouldn't assume all of this is for good. I know none of us do, or most of us don't. Malfeasance with AI gets really scary really fast. So imagine AI malware bots that can learn from how they failed and go back and communicate to the swarm so that the swarm can attack better. Well, that you don't have to imagine that, that's already happening. So that sort of thing, recombinant code was just the beginning, where the next time you see the agent, it looks different than the last time you saw it. You just can't work on a fingerprint. But now you don't even have a behavioral constant because the behavior changes and the code changes. So that is a whole world of terrifying that is fascinating to get into. And Vint, you talked about cascade failure. If I want to make one of those happen, I don't have to attack your hardened resources. I can go after your, we've all seen it. If the chat functionality goes down in a gaming app, the world comes to an end. So we have to be really, really careful about cascade failure in the context of agents which are actually trying to cause that, not prevent it. And then the very last thing I'll say that I think we need to think about is what kind of skills do we need? Let's assume we've all been, in order to be in a call like this, in some way successful up to this point in our career or in our life. The skills that made you successful so far are likely very different than those that will keep you successful going forward. So we have to think very carefully about retooling ourselves, not just hiring smarter people to work with us, but really thinking about what is it that we're learning about the new AI methods, about the new ways of encryption, about quantum resiliency or relying on quantum, about 5G, about misinformation and disintermediation, which are three completely different things that are all related. All of these things are areas where we need to educate ourselves, as they say in Jersey, where I come from, pretty quickly, or we become increasingly irrelevant very fast.
Well said, Anthony. And there's a lot to unpack there, and I think I will be able to build some on what you said and what Vint said. But before we do, I see Vint had a quick rejoinder about LLMs and hallucinations. So over to Vint, and then just a heads up, after I give some remarks, Esther, then Divya, then Sarah, we'd be interested in you giving some short observations and or a question, because I took the no mantle pledge, and without Marcy here, I need to make sure we're doing our part. But over to you first, Vint.
Well, thank you for that. I would do this in German, but my German is too weak, so I have to fake it. What wir jetzt ist the artificial id und the artificial ego. And what we do not yet have is the artificial superego, which we need to control the hallucinations of the id and the ego. And at the end of all the little video I propose to do, I'll hold up a cigar and say, well, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar.
Well, that's a good segue, Vint, because I was actually arguing that we're possibly going into an era in which people's superegos may be tossed out the window, and we're wondering why we're seeing what we're seeing. But
it's that I'm sorry, Hal, I can't do that moment.
Exactly. So I will try to stitch together what you've heard so far from both Vint and from Anthony. I enjoy trying to stitch things together on the spot and put it in a people-centered context. And the first remark I would say is, I think if there's a common theme between what Vint said and what Anthony said, and the purpose of the People-Centered Internet Coalition, it's that the good news is, folks, we're increasingly democratizing technology. The bad news, folks, is we are increasingly democratizing technology. And I know, Vint, you were one of many that helped create the internet, but you played a role. And the good news is, the things that people can do, it's amazing what they can do. And the things that people can do, it's also stunning what they can do too. And so I think this is part of the broader trend for the short-term future ahead. We've got to figure out how to deal with people that are able to do things that only large nations 40 or 50 years could do. My own background, back in the 90s, I was working on classified US government satellites that now you can do commercially. I mean, the fact that I can tell you that there are commercial satellites that are able to do 1 meter or better, in some cases 0.25 meter resolution anywhere on the planet, and hyperspectral, and they can also do change detection. So it's not actually an image, but it's change detection accurate to 1 millimeter. In a past life, I couldn't say that out loud, and now I can. And so the internet is connecting, of course, those satellites, and we've got to think about what kind of world do we want when these things are flying overhead. They are constantly on, that we have access to the internet everywhere. Do we want a world where 10 years from now, there's a divorce case and one of the aggrieved spouses brings the divorce case forward saying, you said you were going to the grocery store, but I know from satellite footage you went someplace else. Do we want that? And so these are things that I think we've got to figure out in very short order. And as Anthony talked about with regulation, and that you need some regulator to not asphyxiate. But the question is, can the forms that we currently have for civil societies and governance keep up with this? And what does that mean? There are also some good news with this too, that it will be a lot harder to be an oppressive regime and hide things. It'll be a lot harder. If you heard recently, of course, South Africa, there was some illegal mining that went on. That will be visible from space. And so we're going to deal with the fact that, to use another line from another movie, Sneakers, no more secrets in some respects, that we will know more about the planet and about humanity than ever before. But the question is, what does that mean? The other thing I would go forward and also say with the internet is that it allows rapid transfer of information and knowledge. And knowledge is not always expertise or sophistication. And so as we've all experienced, you can probably go online, you go to the doctor and the doctor says you don't have something or it's not really this issue. You can probably go online and find some information that will counter what your doctor said on the internet. It doesn't mean it's real, but you will find that information. And so, the good news is we've leveled the playing field. The bad news is we've leveled the playing field. And so again, it's thinking about what are the roles of, is expertise even valued in the world going forward? And then also when you hear about, I guess there was recently about 2 or 3 weeks ago in Science, they talked about how a large language model might help inform you as to what bioterrorism agent that you might want to brew. Well, it was kind of a hypey article. You don't need an AI to tell you that. You can already find that on the internet pretty quickly. The question, though, is will you have the sophistication and the knowledge to generate those bioterrorism agents on your own or not? And even if you do get the information from the internet, will you be skilled enough to do that? And so one of the things that I had when I was doing bioterrorism preparedness back in the 2000s is I said there are 2 things that don't respect borders. One is viruses and bacteria, and clearly we all just experienced that with COVID. And 2, packets. In general, they will go where they're routed. And Vint was talking about how some countries are trying to lock down with domain names and sovereignty, but even then, border gateway protocol, there's ways to work around it. We've seen already where packets can get routed to a country they're not supposed to. And so this is an interesting world in which do borders still matter? And you see nations trying to double down on it. but code may not respect borders and other things like that. And so I think this is an interesting question about the world as well, which is, do nation states still play a role in 2035? Or is it going to be something else like Estonia's model, where you can be an e-resident of Estonia anywhere in the world? I've also heard, for example, Singapore thinking about a similar model for Singapore. So we may be shifting from nation states to networks. The next thing I would put forward, so back in 2009, I was in Afghanistan and was trying to do the best to alert both humanitarian and military efforts for something that now in hindsight seems very redolent, which is it's gotten a lot easier to be an asymmetric defender against a large oppressor. And we should have learned that lesson in Afghanistan. We definitely are seeing that right now in Ukraine, where a much smaller force that initially was under-resourced was able to hold back the Russian forces. But this does raise interesting questions about other challenges in the world. Does the internet, with its ability to both transfer knowledge, but also to do asymmetric effects, does it serve as a force to make it easier to defend your territorial locally? I mean, no one's worried about Ukraine going on the offensive and taking over the world. But we are able to see where what was initially a less resource force, now it's a little bit more on par, can hold back a larger force that was invading. And you can bet that there are large countries of, say, 1.4 billion people that are looking at a small island nation of 24 million people, wondering what that means for the future as well. And so there may be some good news to unpack there. And then finally, well, actually, two other points I will say real quick is, one, as many of you know, back in 2017 and 2018, I experienced a disinformation attack that was actually generated domestically within the United States. There were 24 million comments on the FCC that occurred. And later, as the New York Attorney General pointed out, that I had also pointed out at the time, it was revealed that more than 18 million of these 23 million comments were from both political parties. 9 million from one side of the aisle that hired 6 entities, companies, to use bots to generate these comments and submit them en masse. And then 9 million from the other side of the aisle that actually hired teenagers or recruited teenagers to do the same thing. And that was 2017, 2018. And so with everything that Anthony was talking about with large language models, if our society is partly dependent on comments and feedback online as being a way to have a voice in our society, do we require actually now validation that you truly are a human? And what does that mean for civil rights? What does that mean for avoiding surveillance? You can bet that there are certain countries that are autocracies would love to see the United States say, we're going to require you to prove who you are before you can say anything in this society. But I think we would lose something there. It is always fun when one has one's dissertation advisor, Ben Kaczynski. I'm a proud SOB student of Ben on here, but one of the things that Ben has talked about that I'm a big fan of as well is we need a solution where you can choose to reveal parts of your identity or not, differential privacy. So I don't have to prove that my age is specifically whatever, it's just that I'm over 21. I don't have to prove that I am specifically David Bray that lives at this address, but that I am a US citizen. And so I think we've got to advance that, and that's harder to do than what other more autocratic nations are doing, where they have essentially total information awareness. But we've got to figure this out, because if what we saw in 2017 and 2018 is just the tip of the iceberg, and we're going into an election season in 2024, how will we ever really know if what we're seeing is something that is a genuine group that is activated and mobilized towards something versus something that has been digitally created to look like it's the case and may have some humans, but may also have a lot of bots in the system too. So the last thing I'll end with, I'm a big believer, and I realize some people here are fans of large language models, and I'm saying this a little bit facetiously, but it's to try and put it out there. We're in the neo-Victorian era, where we're repeating the same sort of rapid industrialization, the same sort of rapid distrust in any news sources. That's where Pulitzer and Hearst existed, and they made their money. But we also saw rapid polarization in the political parties, at least in the United States, in the 1890s and 1900s. What also happened there was, if you also remember, there were these things called Ouija boards, in which people were very into the supernatural, superstition. I kind of think there's a lot of anthropomorphizing of large language models at the moment that is akin to Ouija boards and seances. And it's causing people to assign things to it that are really not the case. I would also submit that also what happened during this period was we also saw the rise of the railroad tycoons. And in some cases, they're called the robber barons. I'm not exactly saying that's the case here, but I think there are entities that are interested in distracting from the power grab that they are doing at the world stage and say, look at the AI, it could take over the world, it could cause existential threats to humanity, because it's a distraction from the actual organizations that are increasingly having a transnational influence on our lives. And so again, I think we really need to come back to, and Anthony sort of put this forward, there is something to be said for agency, and there are some that are trying to rush forward and assign agency and individualism to the AI. I worry that that's to try and wash their hands of saying, well, it did something that we weren't expecting, when in fact, and I'll be interested to see what you say, Anthony, that, at the end of the day, the data scientists, the business managers that rolled out that product have responsibility. They can't just come back and say it's a person. Now, of course, in the United States, we still have to unpack the fact that we gave essentially personhood to actual corporations, which is problematic too, because at the end of the day, I'll use another sci-fi movie, Soylent Green, it's people. But, I think at the end of the day, if we think about a people-centered internet approach to these digital technologies, everything from the internet to AI, to chatbots, to disinformation, countering disinformation, we've got to come back to the fact that at the end of the day, it is organizations, it is people, and we should be cautious not to over-anthropomorphize the large language models and miss the fact that there are some wizards behind the curtain that are influencing what it does. So with that, I'm going to now go to Esther, because I know she said she had some questions and some remarks. After that, I'll go to Divya and then to Sarah.
So I'm thinking I will start in Russian.
Yeah.
Okay. First, I just have 3 points, 2 brief and 1 sort of a proposition. The first is, the bad news is it's so much easier to destroy than to build.
Nathan.
And so you can, the bad people can mess things up so easily.
Cool.
And
Best to
that-
do.
Oh, sorry. Someone needs to go on mute.
See, someone can disrupt this immediately.
There you go. It's a lot easier to disrupt than it is to. Over to you, Esther.
The second point is I've spent a lot of time in Russia, and the notion that, transparency, it's like, it's not that people in Russia believe the government. Anytime the government says something, the first question is, what caused them to say that? Not, is that true? But it creates a kind of cynicism and a lack of sense of agency, a lack of transparency, all the other things. Everybody in Russia knows that it's a total shit show at the top, and that whoever comes in is not going to have a nice and tidy government to run. It's going to be a bunch of sharks trading places with another bunch of sharks. And that's just sort of the perspective one gets in a world of disinformation. It's not that people believe everything. That's more the model China would like to have, but it's not quite working. China's very brittle. Russia is very robust because it's not pretending to be organized. It's not whatever. So my third point / question, we're talking about regulations, we're talking about accountability and all these things. And those are very good for the people who follow the rules and who are trackable. But I think the big danger, and it's not specific to AI, but it's AI's and specifically LLM's ability to basically to manipulate people at scale. And the sad fact is it's not just politicians trying to get votes, it's businesses trying to addict people to whatever it is that they sell. And partly they sell stuff that's attractive, and partly they sell stuff that makes you desperate for more that's probably bad for you. And I won't go into that at great length. And it occurs to me the best antidote to that is not a set of regulations, but more a set of basic principles and culture. Look at the job of denying medical claims for a predatory healthcare system. It's a pretty depressing job. People know that. It's fairly lucrative. But I'm sure there are a lot of people who, if they lost that job to an AI and got offered a job teaching kids, or, what we need to do is transform our society where we pay people money to do mind-numbing work that an AI could do and start paying them and respecting them and subsidizing them to raise children, whether that's by training their parents, you know, teaching in high school, doing childcare. But we need to foster this mental health / care economy that consists of real people assisting real people, and go back to the Victorian era where women had no other options. And so smart women were paid well to take care of other people. Now women have more opportunities, and let's start paying both men and women more to train other people. So instead of worrying about training our eyes, we start worrying about training our kids. And yeah, that's the proposition. I'd love feedback, pick holes in it, or apply for a job.
Wow, that's you really have tossed on the gauntlet. I think you hit the nail on the head, and that may be in an era in which we're seeing the norms of the past get tossed out the window, and we haven't seen the new norms put in yet. The question is, one, that's clearly a norm that would be nice to put in. I guess I would go, Vint and Anthony, do you have thoughts about, if we want to be the change that we want to see in the world, who can you motivate? Is that a role, would anyone get elected on that campaign? Would any corporation send forward? I see Anthony has raised his physical hand, so I'll go to Anthony and then maybe to Vint for some rejoinders. Anthony?
Biden sort of likes it. Just,
yeah.
I mean, just for what it's worth, there's a lot of research being done in healthcare about people and mental health. There's a lot of visibility of the bad mental health impacts of the internet. I don't know if you know the Sapien Lab. If not, I'll put it in the chat. And a lot of what Biden's talking about is fundamentally this kind of stuff. I mean, not that he's not very effective at selling either himself or his policies at this point, but he's trying.
That's all we can do. All right, Anthony, over to you.
So two things quickly in response. First of all, David, you indirectly referred to us having to prove to the internet, I'll just put that in quotes, that we are a human before we do something. And I love to point out that this is exactly the opposite of the Turing test, where
Exactly.
AI is supposed to prove to us that, so we cannot argue in any credible way that we haven't passed some absurd point of inflection, right? This idea of personhood and we need some new words, right? So in the law, they refer to the corporate person to try to get around the nuance that you talked about. I don't know if we're going to have the digital person or the algorithmic person or something like that, but we're probably going to need some new terminology. Back to this, what do people do? I was doing some research before this call, and I found this. It's on the internet, so it must be true, right? I found this statistic that by 2030, there'll be a 31.4% increase in jobs related to data science and AI. So I don't like to just swallow facts without knowing where they came from. So I kind of went down the rabbit hole to figure out where this fact came from. And it came from a case study that was done by the India Brand Equity Foundation, which is part of the Department of Commerce, focused on promoting India workforce, right? So, well, big surprise, there'll be a 31% increase in demand for the types of services that we can offer to the world. Doesn't make it not true, right? You're going to get tired of hearing me say this, but whenever we talk about truth, there's the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The reason we swear those three things is because they're three different things, right? This might be a part of the truth, but not the whole truth. So the question becomes, what job do I want to go get if I'm going to work in this community? Do I want to help tag pictures so the convolutional neural networks do a better job of differentiating between a Chihuahua and a blueberry muffin? Or do I want to get a job that involves empathy or innovation or creation? And if the world doesn't pay much for things that involve empathy, creation, and innovation, and I can make a lot of money clicking, yes, that's a dog, no, that's not a dog, do I create my own circle of hell? So I think that part of this creating better opportunity for people using this amazing technology that we have is exactly what you said, David. Let the machines do the things that we already understand how to do at scale, faster and better than we could at scale, without requiring lots of humans. And then let's use that freed up capacity do something that right now either we haven't thought about yet because we don't have the right language, or we don't have the bandwidth to do because we're too busy doing those other things. If we just serve the machine, then we're going to get what we deserve. I say all the time, I'll never report to a robot, and then the GPS tells me to turn right, and I turn right. Right. So we are already taking direction from algorithms and robots. Get over it. Right. The question is, what are we going to do with this?
Well said. And I'll do a quick build on what you said and what Esther said before I go to you, Vint. I'm taking what Esther said about a world in which we need to focus on both mental health, caring for people, and the empathy part, and trying to envision how do we get there. And I'll give two positive scenarios as to how we get there. One, if we look at the broad scope of history, humanity, some may disagree as to how much time was spent as hunter-gatherers, but regardless, let's assume that for most of human history, you always had to be on guard of being attacked. And then it wasn't until we started settling down and we started building walls that you didn't have to be on 24/7 vigilance, because there were other people that would take care of that. But you still were a farm laborer. You were doing agriculture, and that was a 7-day-a-week job. And then came industrialization, and in theory, it was 6 12-hour days. And then came supposedly, the knowledge economy, and we were supposedly working 5 days a week, 8 to 9 hours. And now it may very well be that with the some of, like Anthony was saying, the rote repetitive jobs, we could have technically less hours of actual work, giving us more time to do advocations versus vocations, such as take care of people. And so it may be that, again, capitalism doesn't reward the jobs that we need to be doing, but if we have enough from our 4-hour or 5-hour a day job, or our 3-day or 4-day-a-week job, we could spend the rest of the time doing advocation work that is of the type that Esther's talking about. And that's one path. The other path that I'll say real quick is and if you haven't seen the show Mrs. Davis, it is one of the quirkiest and weirdest observations about what a future of AI might look like. You have to get past the first 2 or 3 episodes as being it's only an 8 episode series, but it puts forward, and I won't reveal too much, what if actually humans gave in to letting the machine task them to do empathetic works for others? And so again, Anthony may only have 30 minutes in the day, but if he takes those 30 minutes to help someone in need, that frees that person up to help someone else in need. And so maybe, and this may be why we're seeing the norms sort of competing, is maybe we're building a separate empathy exchange system, completely separate from the financial capitalism system that we have. And I'm not promoting this thing called Sesame Social Credit, because we know a country that's already doing that, and I'm worried about how that's misused. But if you put forward and say, maybe some of the reason why people are really worried about the norms that are coming, if we create a parallel track system for rewarding those that do things that help everyone else, that's separate from capitalism, that may unseat some of the incumbent powers that may not like that. But I know, Esther, I'll let you do a real quick joiner and then I'll go to Vint. Esther?
Yeah, I'm worried about, the whole point is for this thing not to be transactional.
Right.
I mean, it's not a problem to be paid for a job. There are meaningful jobs that people love doing and are paid for. It's more that than, but don't create a parallel system, because then you end up trying to transfer the points, and the whole point of it is doing something that is meaningful while you are paid. I can go to much later at great length, but
I guess I'm with you 100%. And as one who, my father was a Methodist minister, my mom was a school teacher. I mean, they clearly did what they loved. But I also know there were some times when we were on really hard financial straits. And so there's this trade-off between doing what you love and if you want to raise kids. And so solving that is a little bit harder.
yeah, I mean, the government should invest in it. It's just, you shouldn't create a parallel system.
Right. Yeah. Well, we won't take it too far. The challenge that I would say with that is, and obviously I'm for what you're saying, except that then you also may create perverse incentives and, anyway, it gets hard to have a government that because we know, like example, in the 2000s, they thought the future was biology. And so they incentivized people to get lots of PhDs in biology. And when they graduated, they actually couldn't get a job because there was an oversupply. And so government doesn't do a really good job of being adaptive. And what we need is something that's both adaptive, but also, like you said, is overcoming just default incentives by themselves.
Yeah, just don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
True. All right, so then on that, you have a lot to tackle. Anything that you want to address on the idea of, can we use the internet, can we use digital technologies to encourage people to pursue more caring, empathetic roles in society that could include addressing both physical and mental health?
I'm sorry, you were asking me and not Ben, is that right?
I'm asking you, Vint. Yes, yes.
Wow, okay, I was hoping to escape trying to answer such a hard question.
Well, you can also say that's a great question. What I really want to talk about, if you want to segue, so it's up to you.
That's the classic graduate student technique, which is to change the question until you can answer it. Well, look, we have survived pretty dramatic changes in technology over time. I mean, you go back to 900 AD and the arrival of the longbow, which changed the art of warfare dramatically. So I am, as you know, still very optimistic that somehow we will learn how to use this technology in constructive ways. The problem is a little bit like it was rumored, I guess, that was it Churchill that said that Americans eventually get the right answer, but they have to try everything else first.
Yep.
It may be that we will experience a whole bunch of bad choices for a while until we understand how these things work and how they can be used. I thought Esther's point about not allowing your desire for an empathetic society to turn into a transactional kind of thing where you earn credit for being empathetic. I do like the idea, though, of thinking a little more about norms and what should be the norms of the society that we want. And I'm not expert enough at knowing how to inculcate the adoption of new norms, but I would notice that we've had 3 examples of things that might be worth thinking about for insight. The first one is seatbelts, and think about how that was engineered, and some of that involved legal, threats saying if you drive without a seatbelt, there will be consequences. Another is smoking, and we were fooled for a very long time by people who did not have our best interests at heart until finally somebody had the brave, courage to draw attention to the problem. The third thing I would cite, which is also sociologically amazing, is the acceptance of gay marriage, which happened in what seems like a very fast fashion from the hide everything and rejection and everything else to suddenly legal support for that. Can we learn anything from those 3 examples, or maybe other examples that some of you might cite, that tell us how we do the sociological engineering that shifts our society towards one which is a lot more constructive than the direction that we feel like we're heading in right now?
That's a really good question, Vint. And so, Divi, I'm going to go to you in a second. I'm just going to real quick build on what Vint said. Two examples, one from the US and one from overseas. One is our military has historically been the early adopter of integration way before anybody else, both in terms of race and gender and having parity there. It's not known, but it actually, the intelligence community, you could tell people inside the national security community that you were gay, not in the military, but in the national security community, that you were gay in the 1970s or 1980s. As long as you told them, then it was okay, because they just wanted to make sure you couldn't necessarily be blackmailed by a foreign power. And so actually, we don't tell that story, that we generally have the integration happen at those points, but those are interesting things. Because I raise that because half a world away, you have a country called Israel where everyone does do transcription. They do a year to 2 years of service. We don't have 1 or 2 years of service in the United States. And we seem to have this other dilemma in which really the only 2 things you have to do in the United States is you have to pay your taxes and occasionally serve on a jury, neither of which people really love. And you don't necessarily have to vote. You don't have to do any service or anything like that. And we wonder why the language is us versus them when it comes to government. And so maybe one thing we should think about, and this could actually address Esther's question, which is, any point in your life. It doesn't have to just be high school or college. It could be mid of your career. It could be after retirement. It could be any part of your life. Do we need to allow the ability for the government to fund 1 to 2 years of service that later, when you meet other fellow people from the United States, you can say, what was your experience? What did you do? And so even if you come from the heartland or from the coast, or you come from some background, you at least have some shared sense of service that you did that actually could begin to emphasize it. So I raise that because you look at Israel and that, there's a smaller country in which there's a very tight identity, partly because everyone has done their period of conscription. But with that, Divya, questions, if you have a short set of questions or observations that you'd like to share.
Yeah, no, actually, I totally agree with that 1 to 2 years of service. I think that's a wonderful way to bind people together. And by the way, David, to get people to recognize that people that they would have put into the other category are actually very much like them. And when we eliminate this sort of sense of otherness and we welcome people into our tribe, and we're less likely to devolve into our baser instincts. The comments I wanted to make were around some of the earlier comments that have been made about data being very cross-jurisdictional at this point. So I'll just throw out a bunch of things and then I'll just step off. But one, it might be more valuable to talk about privacy and security of data versus ethics around data, including ethics around AI, where we look at human safety and agency at the center, because that becomes a little bit less fraught. It's easier to create frameworks and around things, whereas it may be harder to agree on joint ethics, especially with cultural differences, corporate versus government differences. And so maybe framing things in terms of protecting individuals, if you understand misuse potential and harms, is better. The second thing I want to put to the group, something very valuable to think about, which I think about a lot, is how much of your data is you as an individual. Initially, we dealt a lot with things like digital exhaust and these sorts of breadcrumbs, but now we're into an era of biometric and biometrically inferred data. And so the sensitivity of that data and how wrapped up it is in our identity, especially neural and genetic data, which I think about a lot, is very important. And we have already demonstrated with our technology that we can both manipulate and hack humans, either non-invasively or invasively. The third thing that is potentially valuable to do, although I know that this might create a lot of discussion, is to consider whether or not it's worth making certain data types a global human right. And that would enable us to be able to deal with it in a way that we don't have to worry so much about some of these cross-jurisdictional things. I mention this because I've been going around to a lot of different governments around the world talking about neural sovereignty. Myself and another organization, XRSI, we just submitted something to the United Nations because the UN is looking at neural sovereignty as part of its Declaration of Human Rights. And in that context, one of the things we focused on, which gets back to what Esther was talking about, is restoring a sense of agency for humans and how their data that they produce is used. Modeling on healthcare things like informed consent might be useful because the data producer, so if I produce a certain kind of data, I understand what's going to be done with my data. I understand it in my language at my own grade level, and I have the right to revoke data storage and usage. So it's not to say that we should never be able to use aggregated data or individual data, because making sense of that data could be very beneficial. But that sort of thing, and also technologies that enable us to protect data at the edge as it's being produced, encrypted, named, labeled, made interoperable, allows for a lot of these different things, including the differential privacy that you mentioned, David. Finally, by the way, EULAs do not do what informed consent does. EULAs are to protect companies, and informed consent is to protect the data producer. I also, it brings up an interesting point, which is data that is collected by governments, collected by healthcare systems, and collected by corporations are all treated very differently, and they're all subject to different rights, even though it may be the exact same data type. And that's a very important thing to do. So in the era of neural rights, we've been writing robust regulatory frameworks around this, trying to ensure that people's brains aren't read from or written to without consent, and the consent being a very important piece of this. And, educating our end users, much like Esther was talking about, educating our babies to understand what it means to take data from them. And we have a number of ways of doing like risk assessment of data, but if your data is being banked, if it's not being encrypted, I mean, there's a bunch of different red flags that can come up. So I'll stop talking now. This is like opened up probably a lot of different lines of discussion.
It is a lot. I think it does. And then I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know in a different conversation once you talked about how one of the things that was meant to be circled back to with TCP/IP was to think about the identity layer. And
Yes.
the question is data separate from the application layer, or what would you think about now as you look at TCP/IP when you think about both data and identity?
Well,
No, go ahead, Vint. Yeah.
Yeah, Ben, interested in your thoughts, Ben.
Well, first of all, we have done some things pretty broadly now. The whole Let's Encrypt initiative and the use of HTTPS is pretty widespread. That's for purposes of protecting confidentiality in transit. Other companies that hold data, mine included, also encrypt the data while it's at rest. The keys, however, are controlled by the company. So otherwise, we wouldn't be able to decrypt in order to offer services. But we're also starting to see utility in letting users generate their own keys and control their own data. That means, of course, that they might be the only ones to run programs that can use that data, which is fine. That might be a perfectly reasonable tactic. So there is a lot going on with regard to control of corporate data or even individual data. I worry a little bit about Divya's sort of summary remarks about controlling your data. And the reason that I think it's difficult, for me anyway, is that an awful lot of information about you is not particularly under your control and might never have been or will be. The state requires that your birth be registered, for example, and you don't have control over that. The state does. There are other things about you that are not generated by you, but they are about you. And I'm not sure that the idea that you have in mind is implementable. The one thing I will say is that as soon as you start using cryptography and keys, you bump into the problem that somebody lost the key and suddenly the data isn't available. And if you've ever experienced loss of access to your account because you can't remember what the password was and there wasn't any backup mechanism and you lose all of your email, you can begin to appreciate how potentially hazardous it is to try to lock some of this stuff down. This is not an argument against trying to protect people's personal information. It's just an observation about how tricky it is to toss crypto into the mix without a lot of very careful thought and backup.
Well said, Ben. And I'll go to you, Divya, for a quick rejoinder and just share real quick to folks. I think it was about 2.5 years ago, Vint helped me because speaking about data out of context, I had gotten an email about there was a crackdown in, I believe, a country involving some fraud, some internet fraud. And I forwarded it to someone that I knew that was involved with the law enforcement efforts of it. I said, great job in stopping this. And somehow got magically locked out of my email account 10 seconds later. And while I never got the explanation, it seemed like it involved needing to basically tell the machine that, no, I wasn't condoning the act of fraud. I was condoning the act of law enforcement and stopping it. But I just raised that as things out of context. And I could not get access until I called Vint. So anyway, Divya, if you want to do a real quick rejoinder, and then we'll go to Sarah.
I was just going to say, then I completely agree with you. And that's why I think it's important for us to start recognizing that there are inherently different types of data. And data that is, there's some kinds of data that are inherently linked to either our identity or our expression of what it means to move through the world as an embodied person. Our birth date sensitive, but mostly because it serves as an identifier. It's very different than actually reading your brain waves or reading your genetic code. And so I would say that some of the things that I'm considering have more to do with certain data types. and thinking about them before it all gets out of control, rather than waiting until this happens and then for us to have no way to recall this. There are certain things about myself I cannot change, and my brain and my genome, I can change my epigenome, but my brain and my genome are a little bit harder to deal with. And if that stuff is going to be leveraged against me, I'd like to at least have a part to play, I guess, in speaking about how that data is collected and used and stored.
Well said. Thank you, Divya. All right, Sarah, so you get to bring it home to us before we go to open questions from the audience. Sarah, if you would like to both share a little bit about your background and maybe give some context and or some questions. Over to you, Sarah.
Sure. I'm Sarah Novotny, and I have led open source communities and open source strategy for several of the large corporate players that we have been referring to, including a peer to Vint and to my friend Chris as well. Hey, Chris. I'm gonna have to run in just a couple of minutes anyway, or at least drop to just listening. But I had a couple of things specifically. I loved the descriptions that Esther gave about seatbelt smoking and gay marriage, because I think the gay marriage example is a really interesting one. In the last 50 years, we've seen not only this shift toward new industry with the internet, we've also seen enormous shifts in how we define community and how we connect in the world. And I use connect here very largely in air quotes, because I don't think that, you know, you are connected to your Facebook friends. I don't think that there's something there that does not have the deeper connection, the social accountability, and the cultural transmission of positive things, of hard things, of the things that we all learned, you know, from the community that raised us as children when we were free-range children, some of us. So that kind of inter-community accountability seems to be lost. And I think that has been a lot of the challenge around identity and mis and disinformation, and also where the internet is missing something as far as its information transfer. It can transfer information very well. It does not transfer culture nearly as well, except as a tool in a piece of this. There have to be the human connections, and that's the piece that when we all went in these big companies to everything at scale, we lose those human connections. We grind off the corners that make us individuals. We are all random little pods being moved throughout the industrial system. And that's okay, because it gets us a whole lot of cool stuff, but it also breaks a whole lot of cool stuff around community. And so that's where I'm focusing at this point, and where I have been really interested in hearing conversations about that. So to tie that back to why gay marriage is really important, and why those three examples that Esther gave us are really important, gay marriage is one of the spots where we had a company, or not a company, sorry. So seatbelts, we had the government saying we need to protect citizens. Smoking, had citizens versus the companies, or even the government protecting its citizen against the companies. In the terms of gay marriage, we had communities that were tightly knit against ignorance or bigotry or offense. And that tight community is the reason that gay marriage, in my opinion, moved so quickly, and why it surprised so many of us, because there were enough people that when the decision was brought forward with good information and strong community backing, or the proposition was brought forward with good, strong community backing, and it seemed like one of those things that most people really thought was a good idea, that community beat the propaganda of hate. And I think that's super important in what we're looking at going forward, both through the sense of identity as a singular thing, as in I am Sarah, but also as identity as I am part of a people-centered internet community. I am part of a Global Vanguards community. I am part of a Seattle community. And those, I think, are where we need to draw more than just the rote repetition of everything already written on the internet now summarized into LLMs, because that can teach us, but that won't ever offer us connection or community or creativity.
Very well said, Sarah. And I think you really hit the nail on the head, that organizations by themselves will not help us address the community and culture part. And so we will make sure to touch on that as we go to answering people's questions, because I think you really hit the nail on the head, and that's a good way to bring it back to the People-Centered Internet Coalition. All right, we're now at the point where we would like to entertain some questions from folks. I see Mark has raised his hand, so we're going to go to Mark. But other folks who've been active in the chat, Ben, Doug, Gary, Chris, Justin, Lynn, anybody else who would like to ask Suzanne, just raise your hand. But over to you, Mark, and maybe we'll take one or two questions. And then, so we'll do Mark and we'll do Suzanne, and then we can allow some comments from Vint and Anthony, Esther, and Divi and Sarah. So over to you, Mark.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see a lot of old friends. One of the things that I've heard recently that really made a lot of sense to me is that this community is being redefined from local people near each other or people who want to be members to affinity groups, to just people who share the same interests, which is very interesting because you could then make it worldwide much more easily. People can connect and they don't have to ask, are you a member? Are you a this? And that we get rid of that. The most scary thing that I heard this morning, and hi Esther, I haven't seen you personally in a long time, when you said we have to get to training our kids. And one of the real issues that I have been focusing on for a long time is how we control kids to make them like us, to make them people like us. And that's really what we do. We do it through parenting, we do it through religion, we do it through schools. And so, you know, in a time when everything is evolving, when identity and privacy and property and more is evolving, do we really want to, and how much do we need to control our kids and make them like us as we are evolving? So I just leave that as a question out there for everybody.
Go ahead, Esther, if you want to do a rejoinder.
I mean, just very briefly, not to control them, to basically, and of course this isn't easy, but to foster their intrinsic motivation to learn and to ask why. They don't need to understand how AI works, but they need to understand the why and the motivations of the people who are doing all these things in the world. And I'll be quiet.
I think you should, I think we agree on this, but it's really, we should talk offline, please, Esther.
And Vince raised his hand for a quick rejoinder. Over to you, Vint.
Yeah, just thinking about kids for a second. Probably the most important thing that I feel as a parent, my kids, of course, are 45 and 50 now, so it's out of my hands. But the question is, how do you prepare your children for the world that they are going to experience? How do we prepare them for misinformation and disinformation? How do we teach them critical thinking? How do we help them understand the risk factors associated with being online or making use of software-based products and services? How do we prepare them to react to the serious existential threats that we know are coming, including climate change? So this isn't about making kids like us. It's more like making them better than us, and certainly better able to cope with what's coming.
Well said.
And if I can just react to that, I've started using the term not prepare kids, but equip kids for the future. And so what equipment we give them, whether it's bullshit detection or anything else, is really important. But preparing them is a little more fraught for me.
Sounds good. Well, and then I do look forward to, because obviously it's been a while since you saw Dylan, but I think one of the happiest moments is when the child asks a question that you never thought of. When he was a little bit past 3.5, he asked the question, when did time start? So I look forward for him having that conversation with you, Vint, when you see him next. But with that said, we'll go to Suzanne and then to Justin for questions.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me. I think that this initiative and your cause is something I definitely want to be engaged in. Right now, I am in the process of building my nonprofit, and it's the Foundation for Biodefense Research. And I am trying to take on a huge project, and it's basically this is where Vince, back in the day when David had invited me to listen to you in, I think it was right. It was where we went to the people-centered economy meeting. Yeah, that was outstanding. Anyway, I'd like to use your model because recently, or actually initiated back in 2013, where OSTI has released, as probably many of you know, the open science policy, making research and science and anything that's been federally funded open to the public. And so my goal is to build a foundry, a bio foundry. But when I say bio, I'm talking everything from sand to space. It's a foundry that would not only support research to collaborate more convergently and maybe reproduce a lot of the research, making it available for society. It have a tremendous social economic impact with biotechnology and science. And I'm building this architecture, this framework, primarily using a lot of the resources from National Science Foundation. And I haven't submitted the actual official proposal, but this is concerning because here we're trying to internationally and domestically, I'm trying to make it a very safe space with all researchers and bringing their practices together, right? So that they can share and figure out, not only making their data access to all those that don't have access because of the subscriptions, the gold standards, the high premiums to even have access to research. But now with the federal government opening up these databases for brokers to manage, you know, we've all had obstacles, maybe some of us more than others, with working with the federal government and collaborating with them and, you know, getting help ourselves as independent business owners. And I mean, I guess my struggles have been more related because I'm you know, preserved. I'm older, but so it's not like I can go join the FBI or anybody else. You know, I'm not 35 anymore, and like you, Vince, I have kids in their 40s. And anyway, so building this model, I don't want to be all over the place. It's I would sure love, maybe offline, some help informing this. There's just myself, and I'm the founder and a co-chair. But I have the internet vision for a whole new scientific a vision. And recently, I just within the next month will be publishing my 4th book, addressing biothreats and growth in space. And so most of my research is involved quite a convergence, interdisciplinary approach. But I want to include all those that have been excluded, and because of disabilities and other things, you know, people that have already served and for one reason or another, you know, had to leave service but you know, then perhaps could be disabled, and then there's other people that need access, family members, disease studies, research studies, cancer solutions. There's just so much involved in building something like this when the government has all of these standards and they have all of
So,
these
Suzanne,
restrictions.
so I really
Yeah.
appreciate it. That was great. That was a great summary of your effort.
No, but
Can
you
you
know,
share your address in the chat? That would be great if you're willing, so that folks can follow up and connect with you.
Oh gosh, yeah. What do I need to do? How do I need?
Just type in a chat your email address. That's probably the best way they can follow up with you. I think.
Absolutely, and I'll put my phone number in there, and yeah. But I'd like to build it on your model, Vince. And this is, yeah. I've read your book probably 50 times, and I take it everywhere, right? And we can see that. Don't you see? All see the shift where people matter in these decisions and what they share.
I appreciate everything you're doing, and definitely, especially in the area of biothreat. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Justin, would you like to ask a question, give a comment?
Yeah, no, just kind of, I'm grateful to be here. So I figured I'd turn on my camera for this one. I think my wife's an educator, and I grew up as kind of a troubled child, only to find out later I was just misunderstood, right? And I think that with the whole No Child Left Behind, the underfunding of school systems, the kind of just the backwardsness of chase the money and forget about the human. I think that has degraded societies, that has degraded families, that has degraded pretty much everything. And I think that it takes the coalition of people that are building these systems, people that are doing it, not writing the policy because that takes time, not making the laws because they don't catch up with at the speed. It takes a coalition of the willing like this and others, and connecting those to actually put the people first, put the kids first. We see neurodivergent, and you have sped classes and funds for people with learning disabilities and advanced kind of, they're on the higher end of the spectrum, but the funds are put together. And so what that leaves is most of the funds get put to the people that need a little more help instead of the ones that need to be pushed a little harder. And I've personally dealt with that with my daughter, is like she loves to help others, and she will bring herself kind of down to help them and then forget about pushing herself. And I think that my goal and my wife's goal eventually is to kind of open a school that focuses on technology, but it also focuses on the people. Because I think that that's where we'll get the most bang for our buck, is trying to find a way to teach them what they need to be taught, so that they are prepared. Because I still fight with it. I'm like, you can't have social media because it's not regulated. But then that leaves them inside of a bubble. So eventually when they're not under my household, my rule, then they're going to be caught blind, and I don't want that either. So it's kind of that give and take. So I really appreciate what everybody here does, and I'm grateful to be here.
Well, thank you, Justin. Thank you, Suzanne. So I see Vint has raised his hand and possibly has some comments or some observations. So over to you, Vint. And then I think we'll go to the lightning round for closing thoughts. So over to you, Vint.
So two things. First of all, one of my colleagues at Google has developed a system called Data Commons, where all kinds of scientific data has been incorporated, labeled, and made easily fungible for applications to run against it. So we're talking petabytes of information. So I'm a big fan of trying to increase the amount of data available, plus the software that can process it, plus the procedures that were used to develop it, all the other backups, so that we can reproduce results. So I'm a big fan of trying to achieve that objective. However, in order to do that, the whole system has to be sustainable, and figuring out what the business models are continues to be a challenge. I think implicit in much of what we've been saying is to try to answer the question, how do we increase the value of people? And can we use the technologies that we are now encountering and developing to achieve that objective, as opposed to making them less valuable? And that was part of what the People-Centered Economy book was all about. And I'm hoping that the result of conversations like this will lead us to exactly that outcome, which is making people more valuable.
Well said. All right, so now we're into the lightning round for closing thoughts, and the goal of the closing thoughts is for sort of the panel, both the official panelists and the panelists that jumped in, including Esther, Divi, and I know Sarah unfortunately had to drop off, is if you can give 2 to 3 short things we should think about moving forward. And I don't want to put people on the spot, but I know Anthony is good at thinking on the spot, so I'm going to go in the order of Anthony, then Divya, Esther, Vint, and then I'll finally bring it home. But Anthony, 2 or 3 tangible things you think we should be thinking about as we move forward for the lightning round.
You said 2 to 3. I'm going to say 3, of course.
Of course.
The first one is we have to found ourselves in epistemology. What do you have to believe in order to do this thing that you're doing? And that includes proper problem formulation, starting with a question, breaking it down and understanding what it is, not just jumping into the data, pushing the summarize button. We must start with what do you have to believe and why is this the right way to study it? The second thing is to always think about bias. There will be bias in anything that we try to do using information. The more information there is, the more nuanced that bias. Bias cannot be eliminated. If you try to eliminate it, you're replacing it with some other bias. So understand the bias that's in the answer that you're getting. Where did it come from? Why did it come from there? What might be the motivation? All of those secondary questions that we talked about. And then the third thing is, what do we do with the people? What are we going to do with this amazing resource that we're freeing up by teaching machines to do so much more? And if what we do with it is to work on problems that are right now either not describable because we don't have the language, or not addressed because we don't have the time, or not solved because we haven't put enough people at it, what an awesome opportunity.
Mhm.
Amen. Well said. All right. Thank you, Anthony. Now, Divi, if you're willing to come off mic and share 2 to 3 thoughts, if you're available. If not, yep, coming off mic.
I'm here. I'm enjoying listening to everyone. I guess I would just maybe end after this discussion with considering not just data, but what data types they are, which are the most sensitive. How can they be tagged, labeled, encrypted, protected, all with the goal of promoting human agency without interfering with their use to sort of uplift all of humanity? And more generally, how can we be using data with the goal of uplifting humanity and the biosphere and preserving that diversity?
Mhm.
Definitely. Well said. And thank you, Divya, for all that you do to both promote those efforts and obviously the efforts in thinking about neural, I guess, dignity is probably the best way to put it. So thank you for that, Divya. All right, Esther, over to you, and then the Vint, and then I'll close.
So first of all, thank you, David and Vint, and everyone for an amazing discussion. This is really great. I think my basic takeaway, which is being nicely modulated by a lot of the feedback, is fundamentally, I don't think AI is good or evil. I think evil people win when good people are not self-aware and empowered. And again, we need to understand other people's motivations, and we need the mental capacity, not the technical knowledge, but the self-awareness and basically the mental health to be full human beings and to resist the temptations, the seductions, the manipulations. And that requires norms, whether it's, in the old days when people got married, they got parent training from priests and rabbis. And we really miss that. Parents don't know how to raise their kids. And the saddest thing is not to see a kid on a cell phone, but to see a parent on a cell phone ignoring their kid. So I'll leave it at that. I look forward to following up with a bunch of you, and thank you.
Thank you, Esther. All right, Vint, bring it home for us.
Well, thank you very much, Esther. That was a very powerful image of the parent cell phone ignoring their kid. Wow. So first, I would suggest that we need to focus on accountability and agency. We have to hold parties accountable for what they do, which means we have to identify them. It means we have to have international agreements to achieve that objective. And we need to give parties agency to protect themselves and to function in a potentially hazardous environment. With regard to bias, the failure to detect bias is basically a failure of imagination. In order to detect that there is bias, you have to imagine what that bias might be. And that's actually quite hard to look at a collection of artificial intelligence bots and to determine that they have bias, because you have to imagine what that bias might be. And finally, I'm persuaded by this conversation that we should be seeking new social norms that take into account the technologies that we are now experimenting with. And again, imagination is going to be vital to figure out what to do with them.
Well said. Thank you, Vint. So I'll also end with 3 before we wrap it up and turn it over to Kevin. And thank you, Kevin, for all that you do with the People's Internet and hosting us. The first is sort of more just a realistic pragmatism. I mean, obviously, we had a whole lot of hope here. I'm going to suggest that, again, while history doesn't repeat itself, it does rhyme. And a similar period of rapid industrialization that occurred with this new news media called mass newspapers occurred. And that was, again, a period in which, if you go back to the conclusion of the Victorian era, there was a lot of signaling in which people would signal things publicly, but whether or not they actually did it, that was part of the challenge. Now, the way that era ended and we shifted from just signaling without a lot of substance was sadly World War I, Spanish influenza, and the Great Depression. I'm not hoping that's going to happen, but I just raise that because again, this is not because of the internet. It is a culmination of factors that include rapid technologicalization, industrialization, everything like that. But we are in a period, and maybe social media has a role to play, in which people feel like if they just give a thumbs up to something or a thumbs down, they've done something. And the reality is that does not change the world. And increasing it, it doesn't actually change a lot. And so I raise that because if we're in this era in which we are repeating humanity, putting emphasis more on signaling versus substance. I know everyone here is a non-random sample and we care more about substance because you're here on a Sunday, but see what you can do to involve others, because it's going to take a coalition. You know, one person cannot change the world. The second thing is actually to sort of build on it. We also have an epidemic, and this builds on what Esther was also talking about with mental health, of learned helplessness. We've been convinced that these problems are so big, whether it's climate change or what's happening around the future. I mean, we don't have a non-dystopian narrative about US and China working together past, you know, if anything, it's always the dystopian narratives that are out there. And so this learned helplessness is an epidemic, I think, that we need to address, where people feel like they cannot tackle some of these issues, that they are subject to forces that are much larger than them. And then we wonder why we see the epidemic of mental health. Well, we see, unfortunately, a lot of violence, gun violence, and things like that. And so sort of be the change that you can be in whatever your passion area is, to try and encourage people to actually tackle the learned helplessness epidemic. Because again, we're a non-random sample here, but that's something where we need to be the change. And the last thing is sort of to build on what Esther was saying, what Anthony and Divi and Vint, which is the good news is the internet does allow us to have the ability to walk a mile in someone else's shoes, if we're willing to do that. I mean, I think maybe most of us probably remember having pen pals. You know, do we need to bring back virtual pen pals and letting you have a experience from someone that's completely different than yourself? Because if we're not careful, we will organize by affinity groups that are only people that we sort of share ideas and values with. And that will be just a replacement of one taxonomy of the family group that looks the same with another group that just thinks the same. And I'm a big believer of autocracies of thought eventually become autocracies in reality, and that's not a good thing. So I would just say at the end of the day, if we can do what we can do to move beyond just signaling to substance, if we can do what we can do to actually sort of go beyond this epidemic of learned helplessness, and then finally truly walk a mile in someone else's shoes, then I'm optimistic about the future. But that said, the best way to predict the future is to create it ourselves. So with that, thank you. Over to you, Kevin. And again, thank you for everything you do with the People's Internet. And if we can get a virtual round of applause for our panelists, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And David, thank you for suggesting this, inviting Vint, Anthony, and Marcy. We're saying hello to you from wherever you can't connect from, right? But we would have enjoyed having you with us. And for Esther and Divya joining in as panelists for this great discussion. Everyone, we look forward to having you on the next People-Centered Internet call in a couple of weeks. And in everything you do, be intentional. Thanks for being with us. Cheers.